I just had a quick question because I'm in both of your classes.
Sure.
So I handed in my tests, like, because again, for both of them, a little bit early, and I go back to check in the discussion board and they're missing. I just wanted to make sure you got them and that they're not late or anything. I think I emailed you one of my copies as well, but not the other one. But for some reason, when I go back into the discussion board for both the classes, they're not there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and I just
Um,
wanted to make sure you got them because I did do them and I just so I know like the marking is coming up, but every time and I've checked for the last couple days, but I just thought I would ask when we were like doing
okay,
class
let me check.
because if not, I was wondering if I could resend them to you. I just wanted to
Sure.
make sure you got them.
Just give me a minute. I have to check.
Okay.
Yeah, I have a record of it for the first test. Let me see. It should be here. Mm,
Because I know we have another one later today as well, and I just wanted to make sure, yeah, you got the first ones.
yeah, I've marked it here. Sorry, is your name Anna Price?
Yeah.
Yes. So it's here, and I've marked it, and I've given you your grade. So
Okay.
I I can see it on the discussion board. Not sure.
Yeah, because interesting, like for both of the classes, every time I check the discussion board, there says that there's no discussion board items found. Because I remember seeing other people's, but yeah, I was one of the first people to put them in, and for both classes, I can't see anything.
Okay, I can
But
see it.
as
Let
long
me
as you
see.
have it on your end.
Yeah. Okay, I'll email it to you. I can email you
Okay.
the grade.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Yeah, I don't know if that's kind of weird. I'll probably ask next time
I'm
we have
not
a test too, just
sure.
in case it doesn't come up. But okay. Yeah, thank you so much.
Mhm. 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 Maybe something that I have to change on the settings. So I just emailed you the grade. After the lecture, I'll check to see if I have to change something on the settings to make it available to you.
Well, and I don't know if I'm the only one or if my Blackboard's being weird, but it was like they've been gone since like at least a couple days. I thought maybe they would reappear, but yeah, I have nothing written in any of my discussion boards. So I just thought I would ask you just to double check. So thank you for looking.
So can you look at threads? Because I've created a thread under your test which with my comments. So I guess I don't know. Let me see if I can go display show all.
No, like on both, because I have both open on both like classes, there's nothing written under discussion, like which is crazy because there was stuff beforehand, but everything is missing. I can't find a single comment or a single thread.
Okay. I don't know. I think there's probably something on settings that I have to change. So if I go to student preview, I can see what you see. Yeah, I see. Okay, so that's why, because I can see it, but you can't. So I have to fix that. I don't know why. So annoying. Okay, well, I'll contact IT services. I'll also just see if I can do this on my own. Um, you should, I don't know why you can't see it. There are all these like security settings they've put in place that make it, I don't know, like I'm supposed to hide the grades from you or something, and it's actually made it really annoying. Like it's just
Well, it's
all
just
like
weird that it works
security.
beforehand and now it doesn't.
It's because I marked them, but I guess I'm supposed to like not reveal the grades, but like I don't know how. I don't know why. It's
Um,
just every single time with the grading, it's like all this security. Like it's a big deal for people to see their grades. Like eventually you would have to see your grade because it's your grade, but I don't know.
mm.
Okay, this I think I figured out how to do it. I have to publish all of the threads. I don't know. Okay, well, I'll just have to email everyone. I'll try to make it available. I think it's just the online system because I've marked all the papers and most people did quite well and I have your grade. So I'll just email you the grade. And in the meantime, I'll try to figure out how to make the discussion board public again. It's because I marked them and so then it somehow has just concealed your marks from you. So most people did quite well and they received a good grade. Most people got 18, 19, or 20 was the average. So in terms of the tests for this class, which is 2307, the next assignment is March 6th, and the third assignment is April 3rd. And then you are also asked to submit a mark out of 10 for yourself for attendance and participation on April 3rd. So I will email you your grades for the first assignment, which is a test, and most of you did get 18, 19, or 20 if you did hand it in. And there's some of you who haven't handed it in yet because of different obstacles. So hopefully you can hand it in soon. If you're in the other class, there's another test as well, which will be, I'll post online. And it's the same thing. I can email you your grades as well. Most people did receive a good grade on the first test, 18, 19, 20. Hopefully I can make the discussion board public because I've marked your papers and then I've given you comments, but I'm not sure why it's concealed from you. I can see it, but then you can't. So I have to contact IT services and hopefully, uh, instead of just having your number grade, which I'll send to you, hopefully you can see the Blackboard system. I don't know. Sometimes the point with security is that it's supposed to kind of be helpful, but when there's so much of it, it's kind of like logging in. So there isn't a second test in this class. There are 3 assignments for this class. One is the test, which is over. Then there's a presentation, and then there's a final assignment. In the other class, there is another test today. So syllabus is here for this class. So I will talk about the second test in the other class I teach, which is after this one too. I don't know. I'm sorry about the Blackboard thing. I'm not sure. It's the first time I've used it, so I'll take some time to make your full test because I have marked it under the discussion post that you made. I created a thread and I've marked your paper there. And I've actually given you in-text comments, but the system has hidden this from you. And so I have to make it available to you and I have to fix it. I can see it all, but you can't. So I will try to fix it. I don't know, like it's kind of just annoying. The security thing is really about, it's the same with online banking passwords or anything like this that is supposed to provide security. It can actually prevent the people who need this information from seeing it. So it can be a bit of an, I don't know, it can be a bit irritating. The same is true of like online systems themselves. If it was just more accessible and everyone could just see everything, it would probably be better. So next week is reading week. There's a mistake on the syllabus. I'm sorry for that. I thought this week was reading week, but next week is. So today, if you look at the syllabus, I corrected it in one version and not the other. I apologize for that. So we're going to talk about standpoint epistemology, and reading week is next week. So reading week is actually the 18th and the 20th. So I'm going to take reading week and try to fix the online system so that it works and you can see the comments I've made. So I'll send you the actual letter grade. Most of you did very well. You got an A and some of you got an A plus. But I would like for you to see the comments I made because it would be helpful to you. I don't know. The thing with the online system, I'll just be honest, like when people try to create an online system and they think it's good because it actually has the most security possible, it's the least accessible possible. So the idea that security is actually good for us rather than accessibility, I think is not true because it takes an extensive amount of people's time to then make everything available. The same, like if you were to think about social media, you can just make social media, I don't know, available for everyone. And in most cases, it would be a lot easier if there was less security and everyone could just see everything because the chances of somebody like actually, I don't know, stealing from you, like if you use Instagram or Facebook, for example, and you make it public, it's more likely that you'll make more money if someone sees you on the internet than it is that someone would steal from you. Like if you think about it from the perspective of just time, it's more likely that someone who likes you and who is interested in hiring you will take time to look at your social media than someone who is trying to steal from you. It's just unlikely unless you're very, very rich and then you can create like a public persona that has no personal information and get someone to manage your brand. But if you're just an average person, it's unlikely that having like public social media will lead to theft or any kind of real problems. So I guess, I don't know. I will try to talk to the people who are aware of how to use Blackboard and make it accessible for the reading week. I mean, I guess if you were to think about it in terms of money and economic growth, like the kind of person who would actually try to steal from someone or who would want to kind of plagiarize isn't somebody who's really going to, or it's somebody who has a plan to do any work. And so it's better to, I think, design things for people and keep in mind like this, the kind of person who would use everything properly and be very busy and productive rather than thinking about the person who would steal or not be capable of just being an adult who could have things accessible. I mean, if you think about it in social media, it would be much better and much nicer to imagine social media being used by someone who would enjoy reading about a diverse range of people and looking at a diverse range of bodies than constantly thinking about someone who is pathological or criminal or an abuser. It's nicer just to imagine somebody who has high self-esteem and self-respect and can manage their own money and would enjoy being in relationships with others than always thinking about somebody who is a potential threat. Because if you design like entire systems like social media or credit cards or everything from the perspective of the person who is pathological and a thief and a cyber criminal and a stalker, then you ruin it for people who are actually just trying to enjoy themselves and who actually like others. I will send the grades to you directly. I have them on a spreadsheet, and I have everyone's grades, and everyone handed the assignments in unless you've contacted me. And as I said, the grades, the majority of people got 18. There were some people who got 19 out of 20, and there were some people who got 20. So the majority, or like the vast majority of people received this grade. So if I look it up in percentage form, it is like a really high grade. People did very well, and I'm confident that you will do very well in the class overall. So it is actually 90, which is an A plus. And then there were people who did even better than that and got 19, and there were a few people who did receive a perfect grade. And so I am confident that if you hand in the rest of the assignments, the presentation, the final assignment, you will have a really high grade in the class. Hopefully you can hand in the assignments on time. And I mean, in terms of the exercise, everyone who handed it in followed the rules. It was very well done and also very well written and used all of the systems of academic citation. So in the future, if you would like a letter of reference, I'm really pleased with your results. And I'm also really pleased that people have taken this class, Indigenous Issues, and many of your answers were really nicely written and involved a lot of concern for Indigenous peoples. So this is my email if you would like a letter of reference in the future. I think it's like good as well that if it's an undergraduate class, because at the undergraduate level, people have a lot of optimism about their own careers and their own lives. And there are a lot of problems. I mean, a lot of the kind of issues with Indigenous people in terms of statistics are not things that cannot be solved with the fair application of law, the use of the healthcare system, the use of the banking system. I mean, there really isn't anything that is a really lost cause in some ways. I mean, there are other contexts, and some of you mentioned other contexts that you are familiar with as international students that are contexts of war. And if you were to compare someone's life expectancy in a context of war, even if someone does try to rid themselves of any addictions or mental health issues, it would be really difficult to prolong life expectancy and to have economic success. It's also about the kind of mental health that people will have in certain contexts. And a lot of issues of, say, discrimination are really preventable in the context of Canada. Like, people don't have to discriminate against others. They don't have to be unfair. They can really try to do the best work possible. People can also just decide to not be judgmental or say hurtful things to others. I mean, all of this is possible. It isn't really possible in context of, say, war, for someone to just improve relations between ethnic communities, say in the context of Palestine and Israel. Like, it isn't possible for someone to just to stop people, like at the level of language. Say if we are asked to use polite terms or use kind or empathetic language for different groups of people in the context of Canadian multiculturalism, that is possible. But when people are actually engaged in war and civil war, it isn't really, there aren't a lot of really practical solutions that someone could use every day to even prolong life expectancy, because someone cannot predict outcomes. Canada is the kind of place where you can really predict outcomes. You can predict outcomes using the Canadian banking sector. You can predict outcomes using the healthcare system. You can also predict outcomes at the federal level using a system of surveillance of police. So in the case of the Starlight Tours, after this kind of aggressive policing of Indigenous youth, the federal government has been monitoring the police. They've also been monitoring nurses in the healthcare system. And there are systems of monitoring that involve people from the federal government who actually come to different parts of Canada and monitor people. We have a federal labor union representative who I've met who came to Ontario to monitor people in the high school and university system in terms of their hiring practices of teachers and in terms of their treatment of students, but also in terms of us as academics and how much work we're doing as opposed to how much we're being paid. So the federal government will monitor people if it's seems as though one does not show up to teach their classes, but also if one hires their friends. I mean, all of it will eventually turn into new law and policy, and we will have to follow certain rules. This is why, I mean, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report don't really end with us just reading and not doing anything. They end with a whole series of recommendations to all institutions. And if these recommendations are not met, or if these if it is not taken seriously, if these kind of reports are not taken seriously, then there will be actions. I mean, it's just sort of like anything, not paying your bills or not following laws. Like, eventually you will lose certain privileges if you don't follow certain rules. So in this week's readings, Sandra Harding discusses standpoint epistemology. Sandra Harding is one of the most influential feminist theorists of our time, and Harding's work has been used to discuss Indigenous feminism. It's also been used to discuss intersectional feminism, and it's been used to discuss the idea of gender and feminism, irrespective of, say, ethnic community, or irrespective of what ethnic community one belongs to, or what history one has, there are many who would argue that the writings of the feminist movement are relevant if we consider any context that involves gender roles. So Sandra Harding is American philosopher of feminist and post-colonial theory, epistemology, research methodology, and the philosophy of science. She directed the UCLA Center for the Study of Women from 1996 to 2000 and co-edited Signs, the Journal of Women in Culture and Society from 2000 to 2005. She is currently a Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Education and Gender Studies at UCLA and a Distinguished Affiliate Professor of Philosophy at Michigan State University. In 2013, she was awarded the John Desmond Burnell Prize by the Society for the Social Studies of Science. So Sandra Harding is really well known for standpoint methodology. And Harding developed the research standard of what was referred to as strong objectivity and contributed to the articulation of standpoint methodology. This kind of research process starts off from questions that arise in the daily lives of people in oppressed groups. So strong objectivity for Harding is not objectivity that we all share. We don't all share the strength of a position that would allow us to make judgments. So if, for example, you were doing research about a certain group of people, say a certain neighborhood in Canada where there is a high percentage of Punjabi Canadian or Sikh Canadian residents, and you don't speak Punjabi, when you try to collect research about this group of people, it will obviously be lacking. If you yourself are not someone who lives in this neighborhood, you don't speak Punjabi, but you also know no one who actually lives in this neighborhood, you don't know anyone who's been there for generations, you can only write about it or read about it at a distance, then this isn't really strong objectivity. So Harding was really interested in the ways that people produce knowledge from a really weak position. And it is a weak position as a researcher who just makes a whole series of assumptions but does not actually have any lived experience. So Harding contributed to the development of feminist, anti-racist, multicultural, and post-colonial studies of the natural and social sciences, asking the extent to which paradigms like feminist empiricism are useful for promoting the goals of feminist inquiry. She is the author or editor of many books and essays on these topics and was one of the founders of the field of feminist epistemology. This work has been influential in the social sciences and in women and gender studies across disciplines. So again on Friday, I will send you the lectures, recorded lectures, and the PowerPoints. So I will discuss 4 concepts, and we've talked about Black feminist standpoint theory previously. So I will discuss knowledge production, and I think that Harding's work is really interesting. Some of the themes are a bit repetitive in the previous lectures we've had, but hopefully you'll find it interesting in terms of academic scholarship. So epistemology is the study of knowledge. It refers to how we produce knowledge. How do we form opinions and how do we form judgments? Why do we think we know certain things and how can we make certain authoritative truth claims? If epistemology is the study of knowledge, then epistemic violence refers to discounting knowledge that is produced by others. So when we commit acts of epistemic violence, we try to tell people that what they are saying is untrue. We tell people that they are lying, or that their knowledge is not useful, or it is not intelligent enough, or it is not good knowledge. We claim to kind of know more than others. And if we know more than others, then we can speak on their behalf. We can tell them what to do. We can be in positions of authority over them. And one of the most obvious examples of this kind of authoritarian position is colonialism. So Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak is a post-colonial theorist who's written extensively about the ways that knowledge production was central to colonial rule. So before colonial rule, there were obviously systems of knowledge in place throughout the post-colonial world and among colonized peoples in the Americas. But colonialism really creates this set of discourses or ideas that begins at colonial contact. So one of the most obvious examples of colonial knowledge production, epistemic violence, is language. There are many other languages besides the English language or besides European languages. So colonial discourse is often uttered in the language of the colonizer. And knowledge production then begins at the point of contact in the language of the European colonizer. Although the history of Europe as subject is narrativized by the law, political economy, and ideology of the West, this concealed subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations. The much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. So what Spivak is arguing is that this kind of idea of seeing someone is more important than who someone actually is. So if I see someone, or if I name them as a colonizer, I give them a name in my language. I tell them who they are. And this becomes a form of knowledge that is more important than who they were before they met me and who they were in a different language. So what I deem to be true is more important than what they deem to be true because of my colonial power. So if I see certain practices they have as being unnecessary or barbaric or irrational or worse than my practices, or worse than the way that I eat, or worse than the way that I speak, or worse than the way that I look, then if I am in a position of colonial authority, I am in a position to produce knowledge about who and what is the best, or what is superior. So Spivak is really interested in the economic imperatives, and as a Marxist feminist post-colonial scholar, Gayatri Spivak is interested in the ways that this kind of epistemic violence is a way of creating a class structure. So if you are always in a position to judge, in a position of authority, if you can claim that this language, the English language, is a superior language, and one's ways of knowing their gods, their ways of eating make them superior, then obviously people whom you have decided are inferior have to work for you, and they have to accept the terms of all of your agreements. They have to accept that when you set standards, they have to meet those standards, and if they don't, then they're just not good enough. And this is the way that capitalism really works, that the ruling class will produce the ruling ideology. And so this is also true of epistemic violence. So if I actually think that there is a different set of standards that we should be judged by. Instead of, say, economic growth, we should be judged by our capacity to form empathetic and kind relationships with all others in a multicultural society. And economic growth and the acquisition of objects are not important. While this might be a nice philosophy, it isn't mine to, I can't impart this philosophy in ways that will change the economy or will have a significant impact on someone's life. The philosophy of capitalism and capitalist competition exists. And so the same is true of the English language. I could say there are lots of different languages, and I would like for people to write in whatever language they want to. I would like for people's writing to be just as valuable for people's artistic work or cultural symbols or clothing or food to be just as valued. While I might think this on the in a capitalist marketplace, there is obviously a lot of value placed on conformity to certain norms and conformity in linguistic terms and in terms of the way one looks and in terms of cultural production. Um, so epistemic violence is really a way of creating a class structure. Spivak writes, in the face of the possibility that the intellectual is complicit in the persistent constitution of other as the self-shadow, a possibility of political practice for the intellectual would be to put the economic under erasure, to see the economic factor as irreducible, as it reinscribes the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant of the transcendental signified. So Spivak is giving us this advice as people who are going to produce knowledge or are going to read and write in the university. And I'll read the quote, I'll do a close reading of the quote. If you go to graduate school at a master's level or attend law schools, you might do this as an exercise, which is a close reading of a quote to really understand or to debate what the author is saying. So in the face of the possibility that the intellectual is complicit in the persistent constitution of other as the self-shadow, a possibility of political practice for the intellectual would be to put the economic under erasure. So what is Spivak then saying in this quote? How do we put the economic under erasure? So Gayatri Spivak is a Marxist thinker. And what Spivak is asking us to do is to deconstruct. And deconstruction is a school of philosophical thought, and it was kind of first popularized in the 1960s, I think, maybe late 50s, 60s by Jacques Derrida, who's a French deconstructionist. And so what Spivak is asking us is to engage in a deconstructive strategy and to question how the economic system works. And if we were to think about how the economic system works to produce knowledge, why do we even have access to certain texts and certain stories in the English language? Why do we value certain texts over others? And ultimately, why do we believe certain people over others? Why do we believe that certain people are not only telling the truth, but they are good as opposed to bad? And this obviously has serious consequences in the context of settler Canada and the Americas, where Indigenous people experience high rates of policing, incarceration, unemployment, and poverty. So the desire to see the rich and the richest people in the world as telling the truth, as being the most intelligent, as producing knowledge that we take to be true, is obviously a way of maintaining class structure. So Spivak then continues to see the economic factor as irreducible as it reinscribes the social text. And so what she's interested in thinking about is how economic inequality is reinscribed in texts. And so this quote is from the essay Can the Subaltern Speak? And Spivak is known for this essay and many others, but this essay is actually one of the most well cited in her work. And Gayatri Spivak is interested then in how there is always this sense that capital reinscribes meaning in texts. And so for Gayatri Spivak, in this essay, the writings of poor women in the global south um, can never be separated from their economic condition. So epistemic violence involves then enacting a kind of authority or refusing to believe their truth claims and refusing to understand that the poor can produce knowledge. I think that Gayatri Spivak's work is really important for post-colonial studies and also for Indigenous studies. Um, so when Spivak writes, to see the economic factor is irreducible as it reinscribes the social text, even as it is erased, however imperfectly, when it claims to be the final determinant or the transcendental signified. So this social text exists without any trace of economic violence. So when we see a social text, it could be a court transcript. And I come back to the first class that we started with, the case of Cindy Gladue. So Cindy Gladue is a Cree woman who's 38 years old. She was found dead in an Edmonton hotel room. She had been murdered by Bradley Barton. She bled to death in the hotel bathtub. In the original court case, Bradley Barton was acquitted on all charges. During the court case, Cindy Gladue was referred to as, quote, a native prostitute and, quote, a native girl over 50 times. She was not referred to as a Cree person or a Cree woman. She was not referred to as Cindy Gladue, her name. She was a native prostitute and, quote, a native girl. So Bradley Barton was not referred to as a white man. He was not referred to as a white man, a murderer or a colonizer. He was not referred to as a John or a pimp. He was referred to as Bradley Barton. So how does this text then conceal its economic origins? Bradley Barton is obviously a white man, the same way that Wilfrid Laurier is a white man, and there's Wilfrid Laurier University. If you look at Canadian money, who's on the money? Is it, quote, a native girl? No, it isn't. It is a white man, and we know his name. So this is how the economic is really inscribed in all social texts. These acts of naming are not casual. And this is why the case was appealed and it went to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the case had to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It took over 10 years of protests, activism, writing of letters, threatening of judges and police who lost their jobs for Bradley Barton to finally be convicted. So epistemic violence then is really about doing violence to this kind of knowledge, how we know. I mean, even the knowledge of Bradley Barton as a white settler man who was one of many white settler men, all featured in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Report, who have killed people and who have murdered women and who have kidnapped women. And no, these people are not innocent because we want their names to be great in history. Wilfrid Laurier was actually actively involved in the colonization of African countries. He also instituted many policies that prevented every group of people who is not ethnically white from immigrating to Canada. He instituted a Chinese head tax, and yes, Wilfrid Laurier has a university named after him. But I mean, this sense that we need to forget in order to create the story of great people is a problem, and it's a problem of knowledge production, and it's really a problem of just truth. So if one wants to produce an entire, say, archive of great people, then do we have to lie that they owned slaves, or do we have to lie that they were involved in colonialism? But then how will the lying impact us today? So if we lie and then we get to the point where people like Cindy Flood, who was found in an Edmonton hotel room, and she is, quote, a native girl. I mean, if I die, I don't want a special name, and I don't want the person who killed me to have their own great name, which rules over me, and then I die and all my property is missing. So I guess I have to then defend myself by being critical of what is said and what is not said, and who is producing knowledge and why. So epistemic violence is the use of knowledge to cause harm, or to delimit or deny knowledge to certain groups. And so this use of knowledge is really also about the kind of casual policing that people do. I am not a police officer, nor have I ever been a police officer, and I don't think I will be. And I wouldn't really collect evidence about people. I don't know, because I'm not involved in policing. So this use of these terms over and over again, like native, quote, native prostitute, I mean, what it implies is this person who is unknown to others is involved in crime, unless you have done extensive amounts of research. Like, in order to kind of actually accuse someone of being involved in crime, like say I was a drug dealer, so I'm a drug dealer, so you can just say like, this woman's a drug dealer. Yes, you could say that, but I mean, what is the point? I could just make this up as an example. And in order to actually police, you would have to do all of this research for 10 to 20 years to find out that somebody is involved in crimes. I mean, most people would not really care. They would just think, I don't know who this person is. The obvious answer is, I don't know. I don't know who they are. I don't know what they do for a living. I guess if I read on the internet, I would think that they're a lecturer at this college, they have a PhD, fine, but I really don't know. I mean, that's all. And so if you were to then think about the use of these terms, it is really colonial violence, and it is specifically colonial violence against Indigenous peoples. There are many people who are perhaps part of sex work as an industry. If you consider sex work as being connected to kind of, I guess, pornography or exotic dancing, there's a whole industry of sex work that exists. But to actually think that anytime Indigenous women and girls are missing or harmed, that you can use this language of criminality against them is epistemic violence. So epistemic violence involves the exploitation of knowledge resources or the silencing of speakers. Epistemic violence can be a key part of domination. So examples of epistemic violence involve denying epistemic agency, refusing to recognize the knowledge of certain groups, objectifying, treating people as objects rather than recognizing their knowledge, misreading, interpreting the ideas of others incorrectly. It can involve colonial appropriation, using knowledge to justify the exploitation of colonized peoples, mainstream research, omitting the ideas of other peoples or interpreting differences as evidence of inferiority. So epistemic violence can have a global impact. It can be embedded in dominant systems of knowledge, and it can be difficult to challenge. So it is difficult to challenge authorial claims that are made from the position of really powerful people. When someone has a great deal of power, they can produce authorial claims about right and wrong, about criminality. They can also produce a lot of research about people who are deemed to be bad or unfit, and they can then use the criminal justice system against them. And we've talked about fascism before, and the history of fascism often involved the production of this kind of knowledge about groups that were deemed to be quote unquote unfit. So, the clearest available example of such epistemic violence, writes Spivak, is the remotely orchestrated, far-flung, and heterogeneous project to constitute the colonial subject as other. The project is also the asymmetrical obliteration of the trace of that other in its precarious subjectivity. It is well known that Foucault locates epistemic violence, a concrete overhaul of the episteme, in the redefinition of sanity at the end of the European 18th century. Sojourner Truth, speaking in 1867, highlighted the denial of black women as knowers via asymmetries in cognitive authority and via men's habitually constrained imaginations. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, writing within a post-colonial context, identifies what she calls epistemic violence and claims to know the interests of subaltern persons that preclude the subaltern from formulating knowledge claims concerning their interests and speaking for themselves. These examples are part of a broader history of epistemic resistance through identifying and calling attention to the ways in which knowers have been wronged in their capacity as knowers. So, Indigenous scholars have discussed the ways that epistemic violence has prevented an understanding of knowledge production that is respectful, but also interested in Indigenous people's knowledge. A lot of knowledge production in Canada obviously begins at the point of contact. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is not just about documenting the abuse of Indigenous peoples in the Canadian school system. It is also about the kind of knowledge that is produced by settlers in English and French, and about claims of superiority because of intellectual, cultural, and religious superiority, none of which is scientifically proven, and all of which obviously is a set of ideas that justifies colonization, the theft of land, and an unequal collection. So the calls to action that were made by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada in 2012 involve changes in education and knowledge production. So call to action number 14 is about the Aboriginal Language Act. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report states that we call upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act that incorporates the following principles. Aboriginal languages are a fundamental and valued element of Canadian culture and society, and there is an urgency to preserve them. Aboriginal language rights are reinforced by the treaties. The federal government has a responsibility to provide sufficient funds for Aboriginal language revitalization and preservation. The preservation, revitalization, and strengthening of Aboriginal languages and cultures are best managed by Aboriginal people and communities. Funding for Aboriginal language initiatives must reflect the diversity of Aboriginal languages. We call upon the federal government to appoint, in consultation with Aboriginal groups, an Aboriginal Language Commissioner. The Commissioner should help promote Aboriginal languages and report on the adequacy of funding of Aboriginal language initiatives. We call upon post-secondary institutions to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Aboriginal languages. We call upon all levels of government to enable residential school survivors and their families to reclaim names changed by the residential school system by waiving administrative cost for a period of 5 years for the name change process, and the revision of official identity documents such as birth certificates, passports, driver's licenses, health cards, status cards, and social insurance numbers. So the valuing of Indigenous knowledge and languages is central to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. I would argue that epistemic violence is also interesting to consider now in relation to abortion debates. Abortion debates in the Americas affect Indigenous peoples, and specifically Indigenous women and girls throughout the Americas. So while we are looking at Indigenous issues in Canada, abortion debates in the US following the Michael Dobbs ruling, there have been lots of debates regarding indigeneity in the Americas and the Dobbs ruling. So Indigenous groups have documented the ways that the Dobbs ruling has affected them in the United States of America. So I've mentioned, I think, the Michael Dobbs ruling before in relation to when I discussed the sterilization of Indigenous women and the class action lawsuits that have been taking place in the last 10 years against or in support of survivors of sterilization in the Canadian healthcare system. And the sterilization of Indigenous women and of poor women has corresponded with the rise of the banning of abortion. And it is this kind of what theorists have referred to as obstetric violence. So the Michael Dobbs ruling is also about knowledge, and knowledge that is produced about abortion, and knowledge that is produced specifically about what is and is not moral. So the Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization decision was a landmark 2022 Supreme Court ruling that overturned Roe versus Wade and eliminated the constitutional right to abortion in the United States. The case challenged a Mississippi law that banned most abortions after 15 weeks of pregnancy. The decision was widely criticized and led to protests and cultural change. The ruling has had immediate health and equity repercussions. The ruling has also had implications for states, healthcare systems, and society as a whole. It has also had an impact on abortion liberalization efforts in other countries. So because the United States of America has so much of the world's wealth and has so much of the world's medicine, then when they make a decision like this, it impacts people throughout the world who are trying to pass comprehensive rights to access abortion in the global south. The decision was opposed by prominent American scientific and medical communities, labor unions, and most people who are part of the Democratic Party, but it really doesn't matter. The ruling has gone through and it has impacted Indigenous communities in the Americas. From a philosophical perspective, the kind of banning of abortion is really, I think, about Christianity and the ways that the birth of children is imagined in Christianity and Christian philosophy and Christian religions. The birth of children is not necessarily something that is talked about or is imagined in every group of people or every religious or philosophical tradition in the same way. So, what Indigenous uh, activists and advocates for Indigenous women in the Americas have argued is that the Dobbs ruling to ban abortion in several states or to limit access to abortion in several states in the United States of America has created barriers to adoption services for all people who can become pregnant. And the class differentials are often what has made the Dobbs ruling specifically traumatic and perhaps dangerous for Black and Indigenous women and for other women of color and working class women. So Black, American Indian, and Alaskan Native women, which are terms used in the U.S., are ages 1840 to 49 are more likely than other groups to live in states with abortion bans and restrictions. About 6 to 10 Black women, 60%, and AIAN, which is American Indian and Alaskan Native um, women, ages 18 to 49, living in states with abortion bans or restrictions, compared with just over half, 53% of white, less than half of Hispanic, and about 3 to 10 in 10 people who are of Asian descent live in these states. So because these states that ban abortion are lower income states, they are not New York or California, they are often lower income states, it's most likely that Black and Indigenous women, and specifically working class Black and Indigenous women and immigrant women, will live in these states. Many groups of women of color have higher uninsured rates compared to their white counterparts. So insurance is also an issue because America doesn't have the same kind of full, free healthcare system that we do in Canada. So many groups of women of color have higher uninsured rates compared to their white counterparts, and across racial and ethnic groups, uninsured rates are higher in states with abortion bans or restrictions than in those that provide abortion access. So if we look at the rates of insurance, then roughly a fifth of American Indian and Alaskan Native women are uninsured, so 22 to 25%. Women of color are also written about as having more limited financial resources and transportation options than white women, making it more difficult for them to travel out of state for abortion. So the bans on abortion will obviously impact Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities in really detrimental ways. Unfortunately, the rates of rape and sexual violence are often also quite high in among Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, particularly in lower income states. There are obviously success stories, but if we looked at it in America in terms of state, on a state by state basis, then when you are a long-term resident, and you've spent your whole life in what would be referred to as a lower income state, or a state that does not have a really vibrant economy, then you are at a high risk of things like rape and sexual harassment. And you also are at a high risk of being someone who does not have the access to, say, a flight to New York City. You might not have the financial capital to travel. From a young age, you might not have a lot of security that has been provided to you by your family members. Or you also might not have a lot of job opportunities because the economy might not be very good. So this decision is really about what authors have discussed as part of the new right. And so many authors have written about the abortion bans and the return to this kind of family values model and this ascendancy of, say, Christian domination over all peoples in the global north as a form of new right mobilization. So the new rights mobilization around issues of domestic policy as a response to the provocations of queer people, feminists, and other progressives differentiated it from the old right, which had historically focused largely on foreign policy. The first such campaign of this new movement, in fact, was not specifically about sexuality, but focused on a child care bill passed by Congress that authorized $2 billion for states to use for child care, one of the first legislative victories of the feminist movement. This bill was ultimately vetoed by the then President Nixon, partly in response to a massive outpouring of letters from alarmed housewives, organized mainly through their churches, who had been stirred to action by new right operatives with dire warnings that the government was going to take over care of their children. So this question about money is also about abortion. So refusing to offer, say, large benefits to people who have children is also then about refusing to allow people to have an abortion, which means that having a child is really ultimately about the class structure. So if you are working class or poor and you get pregnant, you have to have the child. And even if you don't have the money to pay for it, you will then have to go into massive financial debt. You will also have to move out of any neighborhoods that might be desirable to live in. And so this is a way that the class structure can be maintained. So family planning might be a way that people who are poor or working class could avoid being poor or working class. You might actually have an abortion, and then you might have one child when you're over the age of 30 and more financially secure. Say, if you come from a working class family, you could do an MBA or a law degree, a PhD, and you might actually be more middle class when you're over the age of 35. You could then have one child and you could be middle class. If you don't have access to abortion, then you might have to have multiple children, and you could have to have them, and it could also be about illness. So during the global pandemic, there were many cases of women who became sick or who even died because they were pregnant and also had COVID-19. So if you are chronically ill or your health is not good, abortion could also help you stay alive. But in terms of the class structure, when someone is young and they're poor and they have chronic illness, or they might even have problems accessing food security, then having a baby might mean that they will be chronically ill throughout the whole course of their life, and they will not necessarily have as much money or capacity to work, and their children might not have as much money or capacity to work. So it is really a way of enacting class warfare against specifically poor women. And I would argue that in certain states, the poorest women are Black and Indigenous women and working class immigrant women of color. So refusing to then allow these women to have access to abortion is also a form of class warfare. It is also a form of class warfare against women who have chronic illness and disabilities. So This new force of American politics greatly expanded in 1973, becoming both more structured and more visible in response to the Supreme Court decision Roe versus Wade, which recognized a legal right to abortion. Opposition to Roe galvanized hundreds of thousands of previously apolitical people, many of them congregation members who organized the effort through their churches. The explosive issue of abortion served as a battering ram, in Rosalind Pachensky's apt phrase, for a wide range of other issues that would also receive attention from social conservatives in the years ahead: sexuality, education, teenage pregnancy, welfare policies, and out-of-wedlock births. So this kind of targeting of childbirth is really also about the social welfare state model. So in this time period, there is a lot of campaigning by feminists and by queer rights activists, by civil rights activists, by human rights activists for benefits and for social welfare benefits, for housing security. And so the new right then starts to mobilize in the mid 70s into the 80s, and then we get to the 90s where we have neoliberalism. And neoliberalism is really the time in which our time period, I think, is still connected to this neoliberal time, which means that we all really have to go it alone. You have to manage your credit card payments, you have to manage your work schedule, you have to manage your investments over time. If you make more and more money and you can invest, you have to manage all of this yourself, and you will have more financial capital if you work harder and if you spend less money, but you must do this on your own. If you can't manage all of this, you could have a lot of financial problems with housing security. You could end up being ill, or you could end up even being homeless. And so this kind of rolling back of the social welfare state and the mobilization of the new right to to create these programs of responsible versus irresponsible people, or these characters that the new right often mobilizes, who are either responsible people who deserve things or irresponsible people who don't, lead to this time of neoliberalism where we all are then left to take care of ourselves. And the social welfare state really is not something that we necessarily think about every day. If you lose something, or if you can't get a job, for example, you try over and over again to get a job. You can try to contact all of these different services, job counselors, employment agencies. But ultimately, if you cannot get a job and you can't access housing, there are very few things someone could do for you unless you are going to be housed in a shelter system, and you are going to have to be on a waiting list for years. So this kind of new right activism leads to this time where we are all really left alone. And if you were left alone in a state that has banned abortion almost completely, then you must actually find ways to travel to, say, New York City, and to use the financial capital you have to pay for an abortion. You have to then pay for a place to stay in New York City. You would then have to do this all on your own. So, with the advent of the HIV/AIDS pandemic during the 1980s, the religious right became even more noteworthy for its reassertion of religious faith and values, as well as the accompanying cultural anger that targeted feminists and homosexuals as the primary sources of the supposed sexual degeneracy evident in the United States. Campaigns against gay parenting, and above all, opposition to marriage equality for lesbians and gay men, have become signature issues for such key organizational entities of the religious right as Focus on the Family and Family Research Council. So this kind of new right mobilization also corresponds to the anxieties about HIV and AIDS and about queer rights in the 60s and 70s. So the 80s really was the time of conservatism and the rise of new forms of conservative right-wing politics and activism in Canada and and in America. So in Canada, there was also this turn in the 80s to conservative politics and the rise of the family and family values. And I would argue that this led to the 1990s, which is the time of neoliberalism, the rise of the internet, and the kind of culture that we live in now, where people often don't participate in public debate, and many people don't want to share a lot of information about their private lives with others. So ideology really drove the new right forward, and ideology and ideological assumptions and ideological beliefs have really defined these rulings, like the Dobbs ruling. Unlike science and medicine, or unlike even just human rights claims or empathy, ideology is really about belief. The belief in the good versus the bad, the belief in truth versus uh, lies, the belief in right versus wrong. So ideologically driven personal decisions ensuring led to the second theme evident in the George Bush administration's treatment of sexuality related issues, the willingness to allow politics to trump scientific findings. And so this is what is really troubling from the perspective of medicine, is that decisions to interfere into reproduction, what I've referred to in previous lectures as obstetric violence, are often not made using a language of medicine. They are made using a language of ideology and a whole set of moral claims. Whether it was the discredited claim that abortion caused breast cancer on a government website by an anti-abortion operatives within the federal bureaucracy, or the patently false statement in a federally funded abstinence-only program that HIV can be transmitted by sweat and tears, the Bush administration repeatedly legitimated the use of misleading and false evidence to support the outcomes it desired. In one of the most notorious comments on the approach to science in the Bush administration, journalist Ron Suskind told of an encounter with a Bush senior advisor who contrasted the reality-based community of conventional scientists with the current White House. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. So empire building and the building of an empire has been central to reproductive politics and obstetric violence in the Americas. So what I would argue is that the building of a North American empire and the control of populations like the Indigenous women who are sterilized, or who have accused nurses of sterilizing them throughout Canada. Obstetric violence is central to North American imperialism and to the building of empire. The refusal, or all of these debates regarding sex education, also came about during the 80s. And the Christian right in Canada, especially in Ontario, mobilized against against comprehensive sex education in the high school system. And I would argue this is again about the building of empire and the building of the settlers. In Bowen versus Kendrick in 1988, the court ruled that public money cannot be used to pay for religious activities in a publicly funded sexuality education program. But under the Bush administration, funding of religious groups has grown exponentially. Besides funding non-controversial faith-based social services, the church-state boundary was violated by the huge influx of monies given to religious groups for both abstinence-only programs and crisis pregnancy centers, which counsel against abortions. These programs, too, have been the subject of litigation because of violation of church-state separation. So this violation of church-state separation and this kind of anxiety about education and public health care is perhaps part of empire building. And what Indigenous scholars, what scholars like Ward Churchill and other Indigenous American scholars have argued, is that the building of this empire and the control over reproductive rights, specifically for Indigenous women and Black women in the Americas and the poor states, is how the class structure is maintained. It is how empire builds itself, by making things like the family and childbirth high risk for certain groups of people. The kind of policing of queer rights is also about the building of empire, and it is really about the class structure. So the possibility that existed in the 60s and 70s that we would all kind of have to follow human rights laws and compete fairly leads to the 80s and the mobilization of the new right against this possible, what I would argue is possible fairness. And so instead, we have the mobilization of new right policies. So sexuality related policies have served as vehicles to internationalize the efforts of the religious right. This tactic is, in fact, longstanding. In 1984, at a UN conference on population in Mexico City, the Ronald Reagan administration announced its controversial policy stipulating that no U.S. foreign aid would fund family planning services in countries or agencies that use their own monies for abortion services or even counsel about abortion. After the Bill Clinton administration overturned the Mexico City policy, George W. Bush reinstated the policy, often referred to as the global gag rule, immediately upon taking office. The Bush administration also implemented policies on AIDS education and prevention in Africa that are heavily weighed with abstinence-only provisions that many critics decry as not only unrealistic but also certain to lead to illness and death that otherwise could have been prevented. Furthermore, the Bush administration's appointments of the religious right partisans to various delegations to the UN and other international bodies have also permitted a renewed attack on contraceptive services in other countries. So this kind of attack on contraceptive services in other countries has been detrimental to Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people throughout the world. The attack on kind of every NGO in the global south, including in India, because of this global gag rules, has had a detrimental effect on reproductive justice and health throughout the entire world. So the US government's refusal to fund NGOs that offer even counseling about abortion has obviously had a really horrible effect on the lives of Indigenous women and girls everywhere. So in India, Adivasi women, or tribal women as they're often referred to, are often at high risks of sexual violence and rape. And this is specifically true because of occupations on their land by the Indian Army. It's true because multinationals try to encroach on their land and remove them. And the use of the possibility of military rape is very real for Adivasi and Indigenous women in India. The global gag rule has meant that many people who have tried to provide counseling for women who need abortions in the global south have been left with less and less funding in their NGOs because the US government will not fund abortion-related policy anywhere in the world. So when you have so much of the world's wealth, your conservative Christian values will create kind of effects. So the effects of kind of empire building, of imperialism in the US will obviously have ripple effects throughout the world. So there's been a lot of right-wing activism historically for unborn children, and this kind of activism on behalf of unborn children and against women has been common in the United States of America. And I would argue that from the 1970s onward, when American feminists and Canadian feminists started to advocate against domestic violence and against labor exploitation, in the 1970s, this was also when lots of women of color who were children of immigrants or who were once immigrants started to advocate for themselves as Americans and Canadians. This was when the new right started to mobilize against these women and in support of imagined groups like unborn children. So I'll finish by discussing intersubjectivity and standpoint epistemology from the Harding reading. And Sandra Harding argues that standpoint theory is important in considering really important issues like abortion. So, from the perspective of somebody who needs an abortion, say from the perspective of an Indigenous girl or woman who lives in a poor state in America, then abortion is really not just about one aspect of one's life. It is about the class structure. It is also about the possibility of staying alive. That if one has health issues or chronic health issues or even issues with food security or housing security, then the possibility of staying alive and life expectancy could be damaged severely if one cannot access abortion. So I'll finish there because we have discussed Black feminist thought in previous lectures. So feminist standpoint theories, which originated in the standpoint of women, have been revisioned as it became apparent that the constitution of the subject woman is the result of a complex interplay of individual and large-scale social forces. So I'll finish there. Thank you for your participation. If you have questions about the assignments or the readings, I will email you your grades from the first test this week. I will send you your information about your grades from the first test, and then you have 2 more assignments after that. Everyone who did hand in the test did quite well, and I'm expecting that your grades will be quite high in the class as the final average. Any questions? Concerns? I will try to make the Blackboard discussion available. So I will email you your grades this week, and then I'll talk to the IT services because I'll send you just the letter grade. But if the discussion board was made available to you, you could see that I've actually responded in a thread to your test, and I've given you in-text comments. So I have to talk to them about how I can change the settings to make the information available to you. So I'll try to do that, and in the meantime, I'll email you your grade. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much. I'll end the class there because I teach another class after this. Thank you. Thanks a lot. And as I said, I'll email you your grade. Most people received 18, 19, or 20 on the test out of 20. So the grades are very high. Thanks a lot. Bye.